I watched Brenda Dawson flip her perfectly highlighted hair as she knocked on my front door for the third time that week, and I knew my life in Fargo, North Dakota, was about to become a living nightmare. "Peter Richards, we need to discuss your fuel delivery situation," she announced, clipboard pressed against her cream-colored cashmere coat. The January wind howled behind her, carrying tiny ice crystals that sparkled in the afternoon light. I could see her Mercedes SUV idling in my driveway, blocking the path where my heating oil truck usually parked. I opened the door wider, feeling the blast of -15-degree air hit my face. "Brenda, what are you talking about? I've been getting fuel deliveries here for 3 years without any issues." She thrust a freshly printed document toward me. Her manicured fingernails painted a shade of red that reminded me of warning signs. According to HOA Bylaw Section 12, Subsection 4, all commercial vehicle access must be approved in writing by the Architectural Review Committee. Your fuel deliveries constitute commercial vehicle access. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Are you serious right now?" "It's heating oil. For my furnace. It's literally how I keep my house from becoming an ice cube." "The rules are the rules, Peter." Her voice carried that particular tone of satisfaction that made my jaw clench. She had been the HOA president of Meadowbrook Estates for 6 months, and in that time, she had transformed our quiet neighborhood into her personal kingdom. "You'll need to submit an application, pay the $50 review fee, and wait for approval at our next monthly meeting." "When's the next meeting?" "February 15th. I felt my stomach drop. "Brenda, that's over a month away. The forecast is calling for record lows this week. I'm at a quarter tank." She adjusted her designer scarf, the kind that probably cost more than my monthly heating bill. "Perhaps you should have thought about that before violating HOA regulations. I've already contacted Prairie State Fuel and informed them that they're no longer permitted to access your property through neighborhood streets." "You did what?" The anger in my voice made her take a step back, but her expression remained smug. "I'm protecting property values, Peter. Commercial vehicles decrease the aesthetic appeal of our community. Several neighbors have complained." That was a lie, and we both knew it. I'd lived on Birch Lane for 3 years, and the only person who ever complained about anything was standing right in front of me. Last month, she tried to fine my neighbor for having a garden gnome that was 2 inches taller than the HOA-approved height. The month before, she'd sent a cease and desist letter to old Mrs. Patterson for having a wreath on her door past January 1st. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly, fighting to keep my voice level. "You're telling me I can't get heating oil delivered to my house in the middle of a North Dakota winter? I'm telling you that you need to follow proper procedures like everyone else. The application is available on the HOA website." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and I noticed your mailbox is showing some rust spots. That's also a violation. You'll be receiving a formal notice about that as well." I watched her walk back to her Mercedes, which she'd left running the entire time. The exhaust formed white clouds in the frigid air. She lived in the largest house in the development, a sprawling 5,000-square-foot colonial on the corner lot. I happened to know she heated it to 72 degrees year-round because she'd mentioned it at the last neighborhood barbecue, complaining about her energy bills while drinking wine that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. I closed the door and looked at the thermostat. 68 degrees. My fuel gauge in the basement showed I had about 100 gallons left. In weather like this, I'd burn through that in less than 2 weeks, maybe 10 days if the temperatures really plummeted like the Weather Service was predicting. I immediately called Prairie State Fuel. The dispatcher, A friendly woman named Carol, who I'd spoken with dozens of times, sounded genuinely distressed. "Peter, I'm so sorry. We got this crazy call from your HOA president threatening legal action if we serviced your address. Our company lawyer said we have to comply until it gets sorted out. We can't risk the liability. Carol, I'm going to run out of fuel. You understand that, right?" "I know, honey. Can you have them deliver to a neighbor's house and carry it over in cans? I need 200 gallons. "That's not practical." She was quiet for a moment. "What about propane space heaters as a backup?" "That's not a permanent solution, but yeah, I'll look into it." After hanging up, I spent the next hour researching North Dakota housing codes and HOA regulations. What Brenda was doing seemed like it had to be illegal, but the problem was that HOAs in North Dakota had broad authority over community standards. As long as they followed their own bylaws and those bylaws didn't violate state or federal law, they could enforce pretty much anything. I found the section she'd cited. It was buried in a document that was probably 100 pages long, written in the kind of dense legal language that made your eyes glaze over. The section did technically require approval for regular commercial vehicle access, but it had never been enforced before. The real kicker was that the bylaw had an exemption for emergency services and essential utilities. Heating oil in North Dakota winter seemed pretty essential to me, but I knew Brenda would argue that natural gas was available in the neighborhood and therefore fuel oil wasn't essential, just a choice. The temperature dropped to -20 that night. I turned the thermostat down to 62 and piled extra blankets on my bed. My husky, Thor, didn't seem to mind the cold, but I could see my breath when I got up to use the bathroom at 2 in the morning. The next day, I drove to the HOA management office in downtown Fargo. It was located in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a nail salon. The office manager, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Doug, listened to my story while shaking his head. "Brenda's been on a tear lately," he said. "We've gotten more complaints in the past 6 months than the previous 3 years combined. But technically, she's within her authority as president. The board backs her up on everything." "Who's on the board?" "Her sister Janet, her yoga instructor Stephanie, and 2 guys from her church, Mark and David. They pretty much rubber stamp whatever she wants." "So what are my options?" Doug leaned back in his chair. "You can submit the application and hope they approve it. You can try to get enough homeowners together to vote her out, but that requires a majority of the neighborhood and a special election. Or you can lawyer up, but that's expensive and slow." "I don't have time for slow. I'm going to run out of fuel," he grimaced. "Look, off the record. Document everything. Keep records of every interaction, every email, every phone call. If this goes sideways and you end up with frozen pipes or property damage, you'll want a paper trail for a lawsuit." I spent that afternoon doing exactly that. I sent Brenda a certified letter explaining the situation and requesting an emergency exemption. I documented the outside temperature, my current fuel level, and the burn rate. I took photos of my fuel gauge and thermostat. I even called a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, was blunt. "Cases like this can take months or even years. The court system doesn't move quickly, and judges are reluctant to override HOA authority unless there's clear evidence of harm or discrimination. Your best bet is to find an alternative heat source and build your case." "What about an emergency injunction?" "You could try, but the HOA will argue that natural gas is available and you chose to use fuel oil. A judge might not see it as a true emergency. They'd probably tell you to switch heating systems. That would cost $20,000 and take weeks to install. I know, I'm sorry. These situations are frustrating. I thanked her and hung up, feeling the walls close in. The temperature was supposed to drop to -30 by the weekend. The kind of cold that made your face hurt within seconds of stepping outside. The kind of cold that could crack engine blocks and snap tree branches like twigs. That evening, I was in my garage trying to organize some propane heaters I'd bought from the hardware store when I heard a vehicle pull up. I looked out to see Brenda's Mercedes in my driveway again. She got out wearing a different cashmere coat, this one black, and approached with that same clipboard. "Peter, I need to inform you that your trash cans are visible from the street. They need to be stored in your garage or behind a privacy fence." I set down the propane tank I was carrying. "Brenda, tomorrow is trash day. The cans are out for pickup. They should only be placed at the curb after 7 p.m. the night before pickup, and they must be removed by 7 p.m. on pickup day. Yours have been out since this morning, because I work from home and I put them out early." "This is insane." She made a note on her clipboard. "That's a $50 fine for the first offense. Also, I noticed you purchased propane heaters. I hope you're not planning to use those as a primary heat source." The HOA insurance policy specifically excludes coverage for damage caused by non-approved heating systems. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was creating a situation where I either froze or violated more of her arbitrary rules. "You're really going to do this?" I asked quietly. "You're really going to play games with someone's safety in the middle of winter?" She met my eyes without flinching. "I'm enforcing the rules that every homeowner agreed to when they purchased property in Meadowbrook Estates. If you don't like it, you're welcome to sell." After she left, I sat in my garage for a long time, trying to control the rage that made my hands shake. I'd dealt with difficult people before. I'd worked in corporate sales for 15 years before starting my own consulting business. I knew how to handle conflict and navigate office politics. But this was different. This was my home, my safety, my basic human need for warmth in one of the coldest climates in the continental United States. I thought about Brenda's house, with its 3-car garage and professionally landscaped yard. I thought about how she'd bragged about her heated driveway, installed at a cost of $40,000, so she never had to shovel snow. I thought about her Mercedes idling in driveways while she delivered her petty violations, burning gas without a care. And then I thought about her fuel. Brenda didn't use heating oil. Almost nobody in the newer part of the development did. They had natural gas lines. But I'd been in her house once, for a mandatory HOA meet and greet when she first took over as president. She'd given everyone a tour, proudly showing off her renovated kitchen, her home theater, her master bathroom with the heated floors, and her backup generator. She had a massive whole-house generator installed on a concrete pad behind her privacy fence. She'd mentioned during the tour that it ran on propane, with a 1,000-gallon tank buried in her backyard. "I refuse to be without power during winter storms," she'd said. "It switches on automatically if we lose electricity." I started researching propane delivery services in the Fargo area. There were only 3 major suppliers, and they all followed similar protocols. Deliveries required access to the property, usually through a side gate or driveway. They followed standard industry safety regulations, and they all had to comply with HOA restrictions about commercial vehicle access. The temperature hit -25 the next day. I was burning through fuel faster than I'd calculated because the wind chill made the house lose heat rapidly. I spent most of the day working from my living room, wrapped in a blanket, with Thor lying across my feet. My laptop battery drained faster in the cold, and I had to keep switching outlets to stay near heat sources. Around 3 p.m., I saw a propane truck pull up to Brenda's house. I watched through my window as the driver accessed the tank behind her fence, running the hose to fill her supply. The whole process took about 20 minutes. After he left, I called the company. "Hi, this is Peter Richards from Meadowbrook Estates. I'm calling on behalf of our HOA regarding commercial vehicle access policies." The dispatcher sounded bored. "What can I help you with?" "We've recently updated our bylaws to require written approval for regular commercial vehicle access, including fuel deliveries. Has your company received the proper authorization to service addresses in our development?" There was a pause. "I don't show anything in our system. Who should I speak with?" "Brenda Dawson, the HOA president. I can give you her number. She's been very particular about enforcement lately." I gave them Brenda's cell phone number, which was listed on every HOA notice. Then, I called the other 2 propane companies in the area and did the same thing. I explained that the HOA was cracking down on commercial vehicles, and that all fuel delivery companies needed written authorization from the president before servicing the neighborhood. It wasn't a lie. Brenda had set the precedent herself. If my heating oil delivery constituted unauthorized commercial access, then so did her propane delivery. I was just making sure the rules were applied equally. The weekend brought the coldest temperatures I'd ever experienced in my 3 years in Fargo. -35 on Saturday morning, with wind chills approaching -50. The kind of cold that made the news, with warnings to stay indoors and check on elderly neighbors. The kind of cold where exposed skin could get frostbite in under 5 minutes. I was down to about 60 gallons of fuel. At my current burn rate, maybe 4 or 5 more days. I'd set up the propane heaters in my bedroom and office, running them a few hours each day to supplement the furnace. The rest of the house I kept at 55 degrees. I wore thermal underwear, wool socks, and a fleece jacket indoors. I meal prepped in batches to minimize opening the refrigerator. It was miserable, but I was managing. Brenda, I noticed, had her Christmas lights on until midnight every night. Her house blazed with warmth and light, visible from down the street. Her heated driveway kept the concrete completely clear of snow and ice. I saw her coming and going in her Mercedes, always perfectly dressed, never rushed, living her life without the slightest inconvenience. On Monday morning, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, an angry woman's voice practically shouted through the phone. "Is this Peter Richards? This is Stephanie Chen from the HOA board. What is this nonsense about fuel delivery restrictions?" "I just got a call from my propane company saying they can't service my house without written authorization." I kept my voice calm and professional. "The HOA implemented a policy requiring approval for commercial vehicle access. I'm just ensuring all residents are aware of the requirements." Brenda never said anything about this affecting propane deliveries. The bylaw doesn't distinguish between types of fuel delivery. Commercial vehicle access requires approval according to Section 12, subsection 4. I'm sure Brenda can provide the necessary authorization once you submit the proper application. Stephanie made a frustrated noise. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling Brenda right now." She hung up. I waited. 15 minutes later, another call, this time from a man who identified himself as Mark, one of the other board members. Same complaint, same explanation. Then David called. Then 3 other neighbors I didn't know. By Tuesday afternoon, I estimated that at least a dozen residents had contacted the propane companies to complain about the access restrictions. The companies, not wanting to deal with potential HOA legal issues, were refusing to deliver without proper authorization. And Brenda, as the sole person who could provide that authorization, was suddenly dealing with a neighborhood full of angry homeowners demanding she fix the problem she'd created. I was in my garage organizing firewood I'd bought as yet another backup heat source when Doug from the HOA management office called. "Peter, what the hell did you do? I've gotten 37 calls today about fuel deliveries." I informed the delivery companies about the HOA's commercial vehicle access policy, the same policy Brenda used to block my heating oil delivery. Doug was quiet for a long moment. "You know this is going to blow up, right? Brenda created the policy. I'm just making sure it's enforced equally." "She's going to come after you hard for this." She already was. At least now other people understand what I've been dealing with. That evening, I got an email from Brenda marked urgent. The subject line was "Immediate cessation of interference with HOA operations." The message was 3 paragraphs of legal-sounding threats about harassment, interference with board duties, and potential legal action. She demanded I contact all fuel delivery companies and withdraw my false and misleading statements about HOA policy. I forwarded the email to my lawyer, Patricia, with a note asking her to review it. Then I replied to Brenda with a simple message. "I have accurately represented the HOA's commercial vehicle access policy as it was explained to me. If you believe I've misrepresented anything, please clarify which specific statements were false." The temperature stayed brutally cold all week. -20, -30, never getting above 0 even during the day. Schools closed. Businesses operated on reduced hours. The news showed footage of cars that wouldn't start and pipes that had burst. The city opened warming shelters for people without adequate heat. I was down to about 40 gallons of fuel. Maybe 3 more days if I was lucky. I'd moved my entire life into my bedroom and office, using the propane heaters to keep those 2 rooms at 60 degrees while the rest of the house hovered in the low 50s. I wore gloves while working on my laptop. Thor stayed pressed against my legs constantly, providing what warmth he could. On Thursday, I saw a propane delivery truck pull up to the neighborhood entrance and then drive away without entering. I checked the neighborhood Facebook group and saw angry posts from residents demanding to know when they could get fuel deliveries. Brenda had posted a long message about coordinating with service providers to resolve the access situation and asking for patience, but the comments were brutal. People were cold, scared, and furious. One comment in particular caught my attention. A woman named Ashley wrote, "My tank is at 15%. If I run out, my pipes could freeze and burst. This is beyond ridiculous. Someone needs to do something about this insane board." Others chimed in with similar concerns. Several people mentioned they were down to 20% or less on their propane. A few had already arranged to stay with family members rather than risk their heating systems failing. The mood in the neighborhood had shifted from annoyance to genuine fear. Friday morning brought a knock on my door. I opened it to find not Brenda but a police officer standing on my porch, looking cold and uncomfortable. "Peter Richards, that's me. I'm Officer Johnson with the Fargo PD. I received a complaint about harassment from a Brenda Dawson. She claims you've been interfering with utility services to the neighborhood." I invited him inside, grateful for an excuse to talk to someone official. I explained the entire situation, starting with Brenda blocking my heating oil delivery, showing him the email trail, the HOA bylaws, and my communications with the fuel delivery companies. Officer Johnson listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, he rubbed his forehead tiredly. "So let me make sure I understand. She blocked your fuel delivery, citing HOA rules. You reported the same rules to other companies which blocked her fuel delivery and others. Now she wants you arrested for harassment. That's accurate. He closed his notebook. This is a civil matter. HOA disputes aren't criminal unless someone's breaking actual laws. I'll file a report documenting what you told me, but I'm not arresting anyone for following HOA rules, even if those rules are stupid. What about the safety issue? People could get hurt if their heating systems fail in this weather. That's a valid concern, but it's still a civil matter between residents and their HOA. If someone actually suffers harm, that's different. But right now, it's just a dispute about bylaws and fuel deliveries. After he left, I felt a small sense of vindication but also growing worry. I was down to 30 gallons. 2 days, maybe less. If I couldn't get fuel soon, I'd have to evacuate my own house, probably stay at a hotel until this got resolved. The propane heaters weren't enough to maintain safe temperatures throughout the house, and I couldn't risk my pipes freezing. That afternoon, another knock. This time it was Doug from the HOA office, accompanied by a man I didn't recognize. "Peter, this is James Fletcher. He's the attorney for the HOA. Can we come in?" I let them in, offering coffee which they both accepted gratefully. The house was cold enough that their breath was visible. James Fletcher was probably 60, with gray hair and a weary expression that suggested he'd dealt with situations like this before. He got straight to the point. "Mr. Richards, I've reviewed your case and the communications between you and the board. I've also reviewed the HOA bylaws and the recent enforcement actions. I'm going to be frank with you. What President Dawson has done is legally problematic. That got my attention." "How so?" "The bylaw she cited does give the board authority to regulate commercial vehicle access, but there's an exception for essential services. Heating fuel in a North Dakota winter is arguably essential. More importantly, the board can't enforce rules in a discriminatory or arbitrary manner. Blocking your heating oil while allowing propane deliveries to continue for other residents could constitute selective enforcement, which opens the HOA to liability." "So, what does that mean for me?" "It means I've advised the board to grant you an immediate exemption for heating oil deliveries and to revise their interpretation of the commercial vehicle access policy. However, President Dawson is resistant to this recommendation." Doug interjected. "She's refusing to sign off on any exemptions. She says you have to go through the formal application process like everyone else." "Even though I'll run out of fuel before the next board meeting," James nodded. "I've explained to her that this creates liability for the HOA. If you suffer property damage or personal harm due to lack of heating, you'd have grounds for a substantial lawsuit, but she's insisting that the rules must be followed without exception." "What about everyone else? The propane deliveries?" "That's the other issue," James said. "She's also refusing to grant blanket exemptions for propane deliveries. She's requiring each homeowner to submit individual applications and wait for board approval. Given that there are approximately 140 homes in this development and probably 60 or 70 use propane, that's a massive backlog." I stared at him. "People are going to run out of fuel in negative temperatures. Someone could die. I'm aware. I've strongly advised her that this is dangerous and potentially criminal negligence. She believes she's standing on principle." Doug looked miserable. "The next board meeting isn't for another 3 weeks. Even if we called an emergency meeting, we need a quorum and 2 of the board members are out of town. They could attend virtually, but Brenda's saying we need to follow proper procedures with advance notice." "How much advance notice?" 7 days minimum, according to the bylaws." I did the math. I'd be out of fuel in 2 days. Even if they called an emergency meeting today, I wouldn't have heat for almost a week, in temperatures that were forecasted to stay below zero for at least another 10 days. What are my options? I asked. James Fletcher pulled out a business card. You can file an emergency injunction with the county court. I can recommend a judge who handles these cases. Given the weather and safety concerns, you might get an expedited hearing, but it'll still take a few days, and there's no guarantee. The other option is to find alternative arrangements until this gets resolved. Like what? Move to a hotel. That's what I'd recommend. Document your expenses. If you prevail in court, you can likely recover costs from the HOA. After they left, I sat in my cold house and tried to think clearly. Moving to a hotel meant leaving my home unattended in dangerous cold. If my pipes froze and burst, the damage could be catastrophic. Insurance might not cover it if they determined I'd abandoned the property. But staying meant relying on propane heaters that were never designed to be a primary heat source in a house that was getting colder by the hour. I called Patricia, my lawyer, and explained the new developments. She listened and then sighed. File the emergency injunction. I'll help you draft it. But Peter, you need to be realistic. Even if we get a hearing tomorrow, which we won't, enforcement takes time. You're probably looking at a week minimum before you can get fuel delivered, even with a court order. So what do? Protect yourself. Move to a hotel if you need to. Keep the heat on at the minimum safe level. Document everything. And prepare for a long legal battle because this HOA is going to fight you. That evening, I was packing a bag for a hotel stay when I heard sirens in the neighborhood. I looked out to see fire trucks and an ambulance rushing past my house. They stopped 4 houses down at a ranch-style home where an elderly couple lived. I grabbed my coat and walked down to see what was happening. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance. One of my neighbors, a guy named Tom who lived across the street, filled me in. The Johnsons ran out of propane. Their furnace quit yesterday. They tried to heat with their oven, but something went wrong. Carbon monoxide buildup. Someone called 911 when they saw Mr. Johnson collapsed in his driveway. I felt my blood run cold for reasons that had nothing to do with the temperature. Are they okay? Paramedics got here fast. They're alive, but they're taking them to the hospital. This is insane. Someone needs to stop Brenda before someone actually dies. I went back home and immediately emailed James Fletcher, copying Doug and the entire HOA board. The subject line was, "Emergency situation, immediate action required." I detailed what had happened to the Johnsons and stated clearly that the HOA's fuel delivery restrictions were creating a genuine public safety emergency. Within an hour, my phone rang. It was James. I just got a call from the fire department. They're filing a report about the carbon monoxide incident. This changes everything. If the Johnsons decide to sue, the HOA's liability just became very real. What does Brenda say? I haven't been able to reach her. She's not answering calls or emails. I checked the neighborhood Facebook group. It had exploded with activity. People were posting about the Johnsons, sharing their own scary close calls with running out of fuel, demanding the board take immediate action. Several people were calling for Brenda's resignation. Someone had started an online petition to remove her as president. The next morning, Saturday, I woke up in my bedroom to find the temperature had dropped to 48 degrees. My furnace had run out of fuel during the night. The propane heater in my room was still going, keeping the immediate area barely tolerable, but I could see frost forming on the inside of my windows in the hallway. I immediately turned off the main water supply and opened all the faucets to drain the lines, trying to prevent the pipes from freezing and bursting. I set the propane heaters to maximum and positioned them near the most vulnerable plumbing. Then I grabbed Thor and my overnight bag and headed to a hotel. The Hampton Inn near the interstate had availability. The desk clerk, a friendly woman in her 20s, gave me a sympathetic look when I checked in with my dog. "HOA problems," she asked. "How did you know?" "You're the third person from Meadowbrook Estates to check in this week, all with the same story. That HOA president of yours has people talking all over town." I spent Saturday in my hotel room, working on my laptop and monitoring the situation via email and social media. The neighborhood Facebook group had become a war zone. People were posting photos of their thermostats, their fuel gauges, their young children bundled in winter coats indoors. Several people had tagged local news stations, trying to get media attention. Around noon, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a woman identified herself as a reporter from KVLY, the local NBC affiliate. "Mr. Richards, I'm doing a story about the HOA situation in Meadowbrook Estates. Several residents mentioned you as someone who's been directly affected. Would you be willing to talk on camera?" I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Yes, we arranged to meet at my house that afternoon. When the reporter, a sharp-looking woman named Deanna Martinez, arrived with her cameraman, I took them inside to show them the conditions. The house was now hovering around 40 degrees. You could see our breath in every room. Frost patterns decorated the windows like malicious artwork. "How long has it been like this?" Deanna asked, her microphone aimed at me while the camera rolled. "I've been without heat since yesterday, but the problem started 2 weeks ago when the HOA president blocked my heating oil delivery, citing commercial vehicle access regulations. Since then, she's applied the same restrictions to propane deliveries throughout the neighborhood. Why would she do that? You'd have to ask her. But the effect has been that dozens of families in our neighborhood can't get fuel delivered in the middle of one of the coldest stretches we've had in years." We did the interview in my frozen living room, with me explaining the timeline, showing the email documentation, and describing the incident with the Johnsons and their carbon monoxide poisoning. Deanna was thorough and professional, asking tough questions but letting me tell the story. "We've reached out to Miss Dawson for comment, but she hasn't responded. Do you think this is a personal vendetta against you?" "I think it started with her enforcing rules that weren't being enforced before. But when I pointed out that those rules should apply to everyone equally, including propane deliveries, it exposed how arbitrary and dangerous the policy was. Now she's dug in and refusing to back down, even though people are getting hurt." The interview aired on the 6 o'clock news that evening. I watched from my hotel room, Thor sprawled across the bed beside me. The story was devastating for Brenda. Deanna had gotten interviews with several other residents, including a young mother holding a toddler who described keeping her child in one room with space heaters because they couldn't get propane delivered. The fire chief was interviewed, expressing concern about people using alternative heating methods that weren't designed for primary home heating. And they showed footage of my house, the frost-covered windows making it look abandoned. The story ended with Diana standing in front of the Meadowbrook Estates entrance sign. The HOA president, Brenda Dawson, declined multiple requests for comment. Meanwhile, residents here say they're afraid, they're cold, and they're demanding answers. Deanna Martinez, KVLY News, Fargo. My phone started ringing immediately. Other news stations wanting interviews. Neighbors thanking me for speaking out. Patricia, my lawyer, calling to say the news coverage would help our case, but warning me to be careful about what I said publicly. Sunday morning brought a break in the weather. The temperature rose to a balmy -5 degrees, which felt like a heat wave compared to the previous week. I drove back to my house to check on things and found a notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, signed by Brenda. Notice of violation and fine. Failure to maintain minimum heating standards in residence. Frozen/burst pipes pose liability to adjacent properties. Fine, $200. Immediate remediation required. I actually laughed out loud. She was fining me for not having heat in my house after she was the one who blocked my fuel delivery. The audacity was almost impressive. I took a photo of the notice and posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group with a simple caption. Just received this from our HOA president. No further comment needed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People were outraged. The post got shared dozens of times. Someone created a hashtag, Save Meadowbrook. Others started posting their own violation notices, revealing a pattern of increasingly petty and vindictive fines from Brenda over the past months. Monday morning, I got a call from Doug at the HOA office. He sounded exhausted. "Peter, we need to meet. Emergency board meeting tonight at 7. Can you attend?" Am I allowed to attend? Last I checked, Brenda wanted me arrested. The whole board will be there, and several residents have demanded the opportunity to speak. James Fletcher is insisting on it. This has gotten too big to ignore. The meeting was held at the clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that usually hosted book clubs and yoga classes. When I arrived at 6:45, the parking lot was already full. I had to park on the street and walk through the bitter cold to get inside. The room was packed. Every chair filled, people standing along the walls, the air thick with tension and body heat. I recognized most of the faces as neighbors I'd seen around but never really talked to. Everyone looked tired, cold, and angry. Brenda sat at a table at the front of the room, flanked by her sister Janet and Stephanie, the yoga instructor. Mark and David, the two other board members, sat slightly apart, looking uncomfortable. Doug and James Fletcher sat off to the side, both with thick folders of documents. At exactly 7 p.m., Brenda called the meeting to order by banging a gavel on the table. This emergency session of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board is now in session. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that we will follow proper parliamentary procedure. No outbursts, no personal attacks. Anyone who can't behave appropriately will be asked to leave. A man in the front row, someone I didn't recognize, stood up immediately. "We have a right to speak. You can't silence us." Brenda pointed the gavel at him. "You'll have an opportunity during the public comment period. Sit down or leave." James Fletcher cleared his throat. "If I may, Madam President, given the circumstances and the number of residents present, I'd suggest we allow open discussion rather than strictly following parliamentary procedure. These are extraordinary circumstances." Brenda glared at him but nodded curtly. "Fine. Who wants to speak first?" Hands shot up across the room. For the next hour, residents stood up one by one to describe their situations. The young mother I'd seen on the news talked about her fear of her baby getting sick from the cold. An older gentleman described spending 2 nights in his car because it was warmer than his house. Tom from down the street talked about the Johnsons, who were still in the hospital being treated for carbon monoxide exposure. Through it all, Brenda sat stone-faced, occasionally making notes but never showing any emotion. When people directed questions at her, she gave terse, legalistic responses about following bylaws and proper procedures. Finally, she pointed at me. "Mr. Richards, since you seem to be at the center of this controversy, Perhaps you'd like to explain why you sabotaged fuel deliveries to the entire neighborhood." I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn to me. I didn't sabotage anything. I informed fuel delivery companies about the HOA's commercial vehicle access policy because that same policy was being used to block my heating oil delivery. If the policy was valid for me, it should be valid for everyone. That's not sabotage. That's equal enforcement. You deliberately created this crisis. You created this crisis when you blocked my fuel delivery in the middle of winter. I just made sure everyone else understood what kind of person we have running this HOA. The room erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. Brenda banged her gavel repeatedly, her face flushing red. "This is exactly the kind of grandstanding I expected from you. You put this entire neighborhood at risk because of your personal vendetta against me." James Fletcher stood up. "Madam President, that's not accurate and you know it. Mr. Richards didn't create the policy. You enforced it against him first. His actions, while perhaps motivated by frustration, were technically compliant with the bylaws as you interpreted them. He needs to be held accountable." "I agree," James said calmly. "The person who needs to be held accountable is the person who enforced a dangerous policy in life-threatening weather conditions. That's you, Brenda." The room went silent. Brenda stared at the attorney like he'd slapped her. "I've been enforcing the rules that every homeowner agreed to." "You've been selectively enforcing rules in an arbitrary and capricious manner," James replied. "I've documented at least 40 instances in the past 6 months where you've imposed fines or restrictions that have no basis in the actual bylaws, or where you've interpreted bylaws in ways that exceed your authority as president. The fuel delivery situation is just the most egregious example." Janet, Brenda's sister, spoke up for the first time. "James, are you seriously suggesting that my sister resign?" "I'm not suggesting it. I'm recommending it. As the HOA's attorney, I have a duty to protect the organization from liability. Right now, the association faces multiple potential lawsuits, a criminal investigation into the carbon monoxide incident, and widespread negative publicity. The only way to mitigate that damage is for President Dawson to step down and for the board to immediately rescind the fuel delivery restrictions." "This is outrageous." Brenda stood up, slamming her palm on the table. "I've dedicated myself to improving this community. Property values have increased. The neighborhoods looks better than ever, and this is the thanks I get," a woman near the back shouted. "My property value doesn't matter if my pipes freeze and destroy my house." Another voice. "Resign." The chant started slowly but built quickly. "Resign, resign, resign." Within seconds, half the room was chanting, the sound echoing off the walls. Brenda grabbed her things and stormed toward the exit. Her sister and Stephanie followed, leaving Mark, David, Doug, and James at the front of the room. The chanting continued until the door slammed shut behind them. Mark stood up, looking shell-shocked. "I guess we need a new president." The rest of the meeting was chaotic but productive. With Brenda gone, Mark took over as acting president. The board voted unanimously to suspend all fuel delivery restrictions immediately and to issue blanket authorizations to all heating fuel companies serving the neighborhood. James drafted a letter on the spot, and Doug promised to email it to every service provider before the end of the night. They also voted to rescind every fine Brenda had issued in the past 6 months, and to launch a review of all HOA policies with an eye toward eliminating overly restrictive or poorly written bylaws. When I left the clubhouse around 10 p.m., the temperature had dropped back down to -15, but I felt warmer than I had in weeks. People stopped me in the parking lot to shake my hand, thank me, even hug me. One woman pressed a bottle of wine into my hands, saying it was the least she could do. I called Prairie State Fuel from my truck before I even left the parking lot. Carol answered, and I could hear the relief in her voice when I explained that the restrictions had been lifted. "We can have a truck to you first thing tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. work. That would be perfect." I spent that night back at the hotel, too tired to do anything but order pizza and fall asleep with Thor taking up most of the bed. When my alarm went off at 7 the next morning, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck, but I forced myself up and drove home. The fuel truck arrived at 8:15. The driver, a guy named Mike who'd been delivering to my house for 3 years, greeted me with a huge smile. "Man, I heard you've had a rough couple of weeks. Let's get you heated up." The sound of fuel flowing into my tank was better than music. I stood in my basement, watching the gauge climb, feeling a sense of relief so profound it almost made me dizzy. When Mike finished, I tipped him $50 and thanked him about 5 times. Within an hour, my furnace was roaring back to life. I set the thermostat to 70 degrees and walked through the house, feeling warm air starting to flow from the vents. I checked every faucet, every pipe, looking for signs of freezing or damage. Miraculously, everything seemed intact. The propane heaters and my efforts to drain the lines had prevented the worst. Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from Officer Johnson, the cop who'd come by about Brenda's harassment complaint. "Mr. Richards, I wanted to give you a heads up. The fire marshal has completed his investigation into the carbon monoxide incident with the Johnsons. He's forwarding the case to the county attorney's office for potential criminal charges." Against who? Likely against the HOA, maybe specifically against Brenda Dawson as president. The fire marshal determined that the fuel delivery restrictions created a foreseeable risk of harm, and that risk materialized when the Johnsons were poisoned. That could constitute criminal negligence or reckless endangerment. What does that mean for them? If charges are filed, they'd face prosecution, fines, potentially even jail time if the county attorney decides to pursue it aggressively. The Johnsons are also talking to a personal injury lawyer about a civil suit. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a while, trying to process everything. I'd started this whole thing just wanting to get heat in my house. I never intended to destroy someone's life. But Brenda had made her choices. She'd chosen to enforce arbitrary rules over common sense. She'd chosen to dig in rather than admit she was wrong. And her choices had nearly killed 2 elderly people. Wednesday morning brought another news story. KVLY ran a follow-up piece about the HOA meeting and Brenda's walkout. They also reported on the potential criminal investigation. By Wednesday afternoon, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets across North Dakota and Minnesota. By Thursday, it had gone national, with mentions on CNN and Fox News as an example of HOA overreach. I did a few more interviews, trying to be measured and fair in my comments. I emphasized that the problem wasn't HOAs in general, but the lack of oversight and accountability when board members abused their authority. I talked about the need for reform, for better protections for homeowners, for common-sense limits on board powers. The Johnsons came home from the hospital on Friday, a week after their carbon monoxide incident. I stopped by their house to check on them, bringing groceries and offering to help with anything they needed. Mr. Johnson, a thin man in his 70s with kind eyes, invited me in for coffee. His wife was resting, but she came out to say hello, still looking weak but in good spirits. "We want to thank you," Mr. Johnson said. "If you hadn't stood up to Brenda, who knows how long this would have gone on. I'm just sorry you got caught in the middle of it. We're okay. And we're not letting this go. Our lawyer says we have a strong case, not just against the HOA, but against Brenda personally for creating a dangerous situation. Over the next few weeks, life gradually returned to normal. The temperature rose back into the teens, then the 20s, feeling positively tropical after the extended deep freeze. My fuel tank stayed full. The propane deliveries resumed throughout the neighborhood. People started smiling and waving again instead of looking stressed and afraid. The HOA held a special election in early February. Brenda didn't run. Neither did her sister or Stephanie. Mark remained on the board along with David, and 3 new members were elected from a pool of candidates who ran on platforms of transparency and common-sense governance. The new board's first action was to hire a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations and to review all existing bylaws. In March, the county attorney's office filed charges against Brenda Dawson. 2 counts of reckless endangerment related to the Johnsons' carbon monoxide poisoning. The case made news again, with legal experts debating whether an HOA president could be held criminally responsible for policy decisions. I attended the preliminary hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom. Brenda looked smaller somehow, diminished without her clipboard and designer coats. Her lawyer argued that she'd been acting within her authority as HOA president, that she couldn't have foreseen the consequences of the fuel delivery restrictions, that this was a civil matter being unfairly criminalized. The prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, countered that any reasonable person would know that blocking heating fuel deliveries in North Dakota winter created a risk of harm. She cited the emails where Brenda had been explicitly warned about the danger but refused to back down. She presented evidence that Brenda had continued enforcing the restrictions, even after learning that multiple families had run out of fuel. The judge, an older man with a weathered face, listened to both sides, and then ruled that there was sufficient evidence for the case to proceed to trial. Brenda's bail was continued, but she was ordered not to hold any HOA office or position pending resolution of the charges. The civil suit filed by the Johnsons was settled out of court in April. The terms were confidential, but rumors suggested the HOA's insurance paid out a substantial sum, and that Brenda had contributed from her personal assets as well. The settlement reportedly included reforms to the HOA's bylaws and governance structure to prevent similar situations in the future. In May, Brenda's criminal trial began. It lasted 3 days. I was called as a witness, testifying about the timeline of events and the communications I'd had with Brenda. The Johnsons testified about their experience, describing the fear and confusion as their house got colder and colder, their desperate attempt to use the oven for heat, waking up dizzy and disoriented from carbon monoxide exposure. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict, guilty on both counts of reckless endangerment. Brenda stood motionless as the verdict was read, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge gave a statement that stuck with me. "Miss Dawson, you were entrusted with authority to serve your community. Instead, you used that authority to pursue petty grievances and enforce arbitrary rules without regard for the safety and well-being of your neighbors. Your actions endangered lives." Only by luck did the Johnsons survive their ordeal. This court takes such reckless disregard for human safety very seriously. She was sentenced to 90 days in jail, suspended pending completion of 200 hours of community service and 3 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the Johnsons for their medical expenses and to undergo anger management counseling. The judge noted that if she violated the terms of her probation, she would serve the full jail sentence. I watched her leave the courtroom, escorted by her lawyer, looking nothing like the confident woman who'd knocked on my door that January afternoon. I felt a complicated mix of emotions: relief that justice had been served, sadness that it had come to this, anger at the needless suffering she'd caused. But mostly, I felt tired. By summer, Meadowbrook Estates had transformed. The new HOA board was running things efficiently and fairly. They'd simplified the bylaws, eliminating most of the arbitrary restrictions. They'd established clear appeals processes and transparency requirements. Property values were actually up, despite all the negative publicity, because people felt confident that the community was being managed responsibly. I stayed in my house. I'd considered moving after everything that happened, but I realized I didn't want to let Brenda drive me away from a place I'd made my home. My neighbors had become friends through the shared experience of that terrible winter. We had barbecues that summer, block parties where kids ran through sprinklers and adults drank beer, and everyone felt grateful for the warmth and safety we'd fought so hard to protect. In August, I was in my garage working on a project when a moving truck pulled up to Brenda's house. I watched from a distance as movers loaded furniture and boxes. The house had been on the market since April, and apparently someone had finally bought it. Brenda supervised the loading, wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt instead of her designer clothes. She never looked in my direction. After the truck left, she walked to her Mercedes one last time. She paused with her hand on the door handle, looking back at the house. For just a moment, I saw something on her face that might have been regret. Then she got in the car and drove away, and I never saw her again. That evening, I sat on my back deck with a cold beer, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thor lay at my feet, panting happily in the summer heat. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom, the neighbor who'd filled me in about the Johnsons that night in January. He was organizing a neighborhood cookout for Labor Day and wanted to know if I'd help with the grill. I texted back that I'd be happy to help. Then I set my phone down and just sat there, listening to the sounds of my neighborhood. Kids playing basketball in a driveway, someone mowing their lawn, music drifting from an open window. Normal, everyday sounds of people living their lives without fear, without crisis, without a petty tyrant making everyone miserable over mailbox heights and trash can placement. The winter had been brutal. The conflict had been exhausting. The legal proceedings had been stressful, but we'd come through it. We'd stood up to someone who'd abused their power, and we'd held them accountable. The system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. I thought about that afternoon in January when I'd watched the propane truck deliver to Brenda's house, and made the decision to inform her delivery company about the HOA restrictions. I'd known it would create problems. I'd known it would escalate the situation. But I'd also known that the only way to stop her was to make sure the rules applied to everyone, including her. Some people might say I was petty or vindictive, that I'd stooped to her level by using the same tactics she'd used against me. Maybe they were right. But I'd also protected myself and ultimately dozens of other families from a dangerous situation created by someone who cared more about control than common sense. The criminal justice system had determined that Brenda's actions rose to the level of criminal negligence. The civil courts had found her liable for damages. The court of public opinion had judged her harshly. And the HOA's own members had voted to remove her from power and reform the system that had allowed her to abuse her authority. I'd survived a North Dakota winter without reliable heat, fought a legal and public relations battle against an entrenched HOA board, and helped catalyze real change in my community. It wasn't how I'd planned to spend that winter, but it had taught me something important about standing up for yourself and others, even when it's difficult and uncertain and cold. As the sun set and the temperature dropped into the comfortable 70s, I raised my beer in a silent toast. To warmth, to justice, to communities that look out for each other instead of tearing each other apart, to common sense prevailing over petty tyranny, and to never, ever taking a full fuel tank for granted again. The next morning, I woke up to find frost warnings in the weather forecast. Early frost for late August, but not unheard of in North Dakota. I checked my fuel gauge out of habit and saw I was sitting at about 60%. Plenty for the remaining warm days, but I'd need a delivery before the real cold set in. I called Prairie State Fuel and Carol answered on the second ring. "Peter, how are you doing? Need a fill up?" "Yeah, I want to get ahead of the season this year. Can you put me on the schedule for next week?" "Absolutely. I'll put you down for Tuesday morning." And Peter, "I've been meaning to tell you, we use your story in our new driver training as an example of why we never, ever restrict essential service deliveries, no matter what anyone tells us about HOA rules." I laughed. "Happy to be a cautionary tale. You're more than that. You're the guy who stood up to the system and won. That takes guts." After hanging up, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, watching the morning light stream through the windows. The same windows that had been covered in frost just 7 months ago. The same house that had dropped to 40 degrees and nearly cost me thousands in damage. My laptop chimed with an email notification. It was from James Fletcher, the HOA attorney. He was writing to let me know that the new board had finalized the revised bylaws and wanted my input on the section covering commercial vehicle access. They drafted language that clearly exempted all essential services, including fuel deliveries, utility work, emergency services, and regular mail and package delivery. They wanted to make sure it was clear enough that no future board could interpret it the way Brenda had. I reviewed the language and sent back my suggestions. It felt good to be part of building something better instead of just fighting against something broken. The rest of August passed peacefully. My fuel delivery came on schedule. The weather stayed warm. The neighborhood Labor Day cookout was a huge success, with probably 50 people showing up to eat burgers and hot dogs and celebrate the end of summer. Standing at the grill with Tom and a couple other neighbors, spatula in hand, beer within reach, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Genuinely content. Not just satisfied or relieved, but actually happy with where I was and how things had turned out. "You think we've seen the last of crazy HOA stuff?" Tom asked, flipping a burger. "In this neighborhood, probably. But there are Brendas everywhere. Someone always wants to be in charge and tell other people what to do." "Yeah, but now we know what to do about it. Stand up, fight back. Don't let them get away with it." I nodded. That was the real lesson. Not that HOAs were inherently bad, or that all rules were wrong, or that authority should never be questioned. The lesson was simpler and more important. When someone abuses power, you have to resist, even when it's hard. Even when it's cold. Even when you're not sure you'll win. Because the alternative is to let the Brendas of the world control every aspect of your life, imposing their arbitrary standards and petty rules without consequences. And that's no way to live. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of fall color in the trees. I started preparing for winter in earnest, checking my furnace, cleaning my chimney, making sure all my systems were in good working order. I even bought a backup propane heater, just in case. Not because I expected problems, but because I'd learned the value of being prepared. On a Tuesday afternoon in mid-September, I was working in my home office when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman from down the street who Brenda had hassled about her wreath. "Peter, dear, I wanted to bring you these." She held out a plate of chocolate chip cookies, still warm. "I never properly thanked you for what you did last winter. You saved this neighborhood." "I just wanted heat in my house," I said, accepting the cookies. "But thank you. These smell amazing." "You did more than that. You showed us that we didn't have to accept being treated badly. My grandson is in law school now, studying HOA reform because of what happened here. He wants to help other people fight back against abusive boards." After she left, I sat on my couch eating cookies and thinking about ripple effects. How one person's decision to stand up could inspire others. How a local conflict could spark conversations about systemic issues. How even in the darkest, coldest moments, there was potential for positive change. October brought the first real cold snap, temperatures dropping into the 20s at night. My furnace handled it easily, keeping the house warm and comfortable. I'd never been so grateful for such a basic thing as reliable heat. The neighborhood had settled into its new normal. The professional management company was handling day-to-day operations efficiently. The board met monthly and published detailed minutes. Homeowners were engaged and informed. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional and fair. I heard through the grapevine that Brenda had moved to Arizona, probably attracted to a place where she'd never have to worry about heating fuel or winter cold. Part of me hoped she'd learned something from the experience. Another part of me figured she was probably already terrorizing some new HOA in Scottsdale, measuring grass heights and citing people for unauthorized patio furniture. As Thanksgiving approached, I found myself reflecting on the year. It had started with crisis and conflict, fear and frustration. But it had also brought community together, exposed and corrected injustice, and taught me important lessons about resilience and standing up for what's right. On Thanksgiving Day, I hosted dinner for the first time. Tom and his family came over, along with the Johnsons, Mrs. Patterson, and a few other neighbors. We crowded around my dining room table, passing dishes and sharing stories and laughing in the warmth of my very well-heated house. Mr. Johnson raised his glass for a toast. To Peter, who reminded us that we're strongest when we stand together. And to making sure no one ever has to choose between following unjust rules and staying warm in the winter. Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt a lump in my throat. I'd never set out to be any kind of hero or community organizer. I just wanted to keep my house heated. But somehow that simple need had become a catalyst for real change. As winter deepened and the snow piled up outside, I stayed warm and comfortable inside. My fuel tank stayed full. My furnace ran smoothly. My pipes never froze. And every time I adjusted the thermostat without a second thought, I remembered what it felt like when that simple action was threatened by someone else's arbitrary exercise of power. The criminal case against Brenda was officially closed in December, when she completed her first set of community service hours and submitted her probation reports. The news covered it briefly, a small footnote to the larger story that had captured regional attention 9 months earlier. I didn't celebrate her conviction or her punishment. I just felt relieved that the whole ordeal was finally, truly over. Justice had been served. The system, for all its flaws and delays, had ultimately worked. And most importantly, no one in my neighborhood would ever face what I'd faced that terrible January. As Christmas approached and I hung lights on my house, following the new, reasonable HOA guidelines that allowed tasteful decorations without requiring architectural committee approval, I thought about what I'd tell someone else facing a similar situation. Stand your ground. Document everything. Don't let anyone bully you into accepting unreasonable treatment, especially when your safety is at stake. Use the system, even when it's slow and frustrating. And remember that you're probably not the only one suffering, so standing up for yourself often means standing up for others too. The new year arrived with temperatures well below zero, but this time I was ready. Full fuel tank, working furnace, backup heaters just in case, and a community of neighbors who'd been through the fire together and come out stronger. On a cold January evening, almost exactly a year after Brenda had first knocked on my door to tell me about the commercial vehicle access policy, I stood in my warm living room and looked out at the frozen landscape. The thermometer on my deck read -22 degrees. Inside my house was a comfortable 68 degrees. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Beer tomorrow night, celebrating 1 year of survival." I texted back, "Absolutely, your place or mine, mine." My furnace is working great, thanks to being able to get propane delivered without HOA permission. I smiled and set the phone down. Thor looked up at me from his spot on the couch, tail wagging lazily. Outside, snow fell in the darkness, accumulating on the streets and sidewalks and roofs. The kind of heavy, persistent snow that made everything look clean and peaceful and beautiful, hiding the harsh reality of the climate beneath a white blanket. But I wasn't afraid of the harsh reality anymore. I'd faced it down and survived. I'd fought back against injustice and won. I'd helped change a broken system into something better. And I'd learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not over grand principles or abstract ideals, but over simple, essential things like the right to stay warm in your own home. The wind howled outside, rattling my windows and piling snow against my fence. My furnace kicked on with a reassuring rumble, pumping warm air through the vents. I walked through my house, checking each room, feeling the comfortable temperature that I'd once taken for granted and would never take for granted again. In the basement, I glanced at my fuel gauge, 3/4 full. Plenty to get through even the coldest stretch of winter. I made a mental note to schedule my next delivery for February, well before I dropped below half. No more cutting it close. No more assuming everything would work out fine, because I'd learned the hard way that everything doesn't always work out fine. Sometimes people abuse power. Sometimes systems fail. Sometimes you have to fight for things that should be guaranteed. And when that happens, the only choice is to stand up, push back, and refuse to accept the unacceptable. I climbed the stairs back to my warm living room, Thor padding along behind me. I settled into my favorite chair with a book, a cup of hot tea steaming on the side table. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, heading toward -30 by morning. Inside, I was comfortable, safe, and warm. And that, after everything that had happened, after all the conflict and stress and fear, was exactly how it should be. The story of my battle with HOA Karen Brenda Dawson had become local legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of standing up for your rights. But for me, sitting in my warm house on a frozen January night, it was simply my life, my experience, my victory. I'd let her tank run dry in negative temps, metaphorically speaking. I'd exposed her power for what it was, finite and dependent on people's willingness to accept her authority. And when people stopped accepting it, when they saw through the clipboard and the designer clothes and the citations to obscure bylaw sections, her power evaporated like breath on a cold morning. She'd blocked my fuel access, trying to assert control and punish me for not bending to her will. In response, I'd shown everyone exactly what that kind of control looked like when applied fairly and equally. The result had been chaos, yes, but chaos that revealed truth. And truth, however uncomfortable, had led to change. As I sat there reading, warm and content, I heard the distant sound of a truck on the street. I glanced out the window to see a fuel delivery truck pulling up to a neighbor's house. The driver hopped out, connected his hose, and began filling their tank. A routine transaction. An essential service being provided without drama or restriction or HOA interference, exactly as it should be. I returned to my book, smiling slightly. The winter would continue. The cold would persist. But I was ready for it. We all were. And no HOA Karen would ever threaten our safety again because we'd learned our lesson. We'd found our strength. And we'd used it to build something better than what came before. That was the real victory. Not defeating Brenda, though that had been necessary. Not the criminal conviction, though that had been justice. The real victory was the knowledge that we could stand together, fight back against injustice, and create the kind of community we wanted to live in. A community where basic needs weren't used as weapons. Where rules served people instead of controlling them. Where leaders served instead of dominated. Where winter was challenging but not terrifying, because everyone had access to the heat and safety they needed to survive. I finished my tea and headed to bed, setting the thermostat to a comfortable 65 degrees for sleeping. Thor jumped up beside me, his warm body a furnace of his own. I pulled the blankets up and closed my eyes, listening to the wind howl outside and the furnace hum inside. And I slept peacefully, deeply, warmly, because I'd earned this peace through struggle. I'd earned this warmth through standing my ground, and I'd earned this deep, satisfied sleep through refusing to accept being treated unfairly. Tomorrow would bring another cold day. Another chance to appreciate the simple blessing of reliable heat. Another reminder of how far we'd come and how important it was to stay vigilant against those who would abuse power. But tonight, I was simply warm, safe, and home, and after everything that had happened, that was more than enough.